Okay, welcome everybody. So I hope everybody's doing well amidst everything going on in the world. Us and Extension are working to bring you our awesome educational content to your home so you can continue to learn with us. Today's presentation is going to be part one of a two-part class called Landscaping for Livestock. And in this part, I'm going to go over how toxic plants can affect your animals, particularly we're talking horses, cows, small ruminants, sheep and goats, and what things to look out for if you're going to start landscaping around your house, down your fences, and then we're going to go over some general toxic weeds that you might find in your pasture and how to control for them. So before we get started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Bainum. I'm the Marion County Livestock Extension Agent. And I'm doing this program in coordination with the Marion County Residential Horticulture Agent, Maxine Hunter. She's going to be doing part two of this class where she's going to go over more specifically landscape design. So I stick to the animal component and she is definitely better suited for the creative part of actually designing your landscape. So let me share my screen here so you can see all of the things that I am seeing. And we will get started. Okay. So landscaping with livestock in mind, most farms that I work with want to accomplish two goals. First, you want a safe, nutritious pasture base for your livestock. That's number one. And then secondly, we all like for our homes and our farms to be aesthetically pleasing. So I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of these large commercial thoroughbred farms, a lot of big cattle ranches, and a lot of times they're on the roadside or they have long driveways, big yards. And if we have livestock, we know we'd like to keep them fenced in, but sometimes things happen and they get out. And so we need to make sure that our landscape is generally acceptable for our livestock, no matter where they might be. So common areas that we're worried about are fence lines, your barn areas. We like our barns to look pretty too, so it's important that we're planting the proper plants there. Our driveways that might be accessible by our animals, or even your yard are areas that you need to be extra cautious when planting your landscape. So toxic weeds. This is a concept that gets people all stirred up and for good reason. When asking some ranchers, the largest economical loss due to weeds is animal deaths. And we don't say that to scare you, because with some simple scouting techniques and proper management, you shouldn't have any issues with this. But weeds can present a major problem if you're not careful. So number one, you should scout your pastures. And that means either riding your four-wheeler, riding your horse, walking on foot. But every so often, you should walk your fence lines, walk your pastures, walk your yard, know what is there. And if you can't identify something, feel free to reach out to your extension agent, me, or whoever's in your county, and ask for help. Send good pictures. If there's a seed head, that's the best way to identify something, either by the seed head or the flower. So make sure you send in good pictures or samples for us to properly identify for you. The next thing is proper pasture management and grazing management. This is going to be the best prevention for toxic weeds making their way into your pasture. So that's things like not overstocking your area, not putting too many animals for the number of acres that you have, grazing management, not letting them eat your grass down to the bare minimum. Weeds are opportunists, so they will definitely come in where there is nothing else. And then finally, understanding proper herbicide application for the different weeds that you want to kill. It's important to know their life cycle. And that's another key point to work with your extension agent so they can guide you on what product to use. So some general weed management in Bahiagrass. We're going to go with Bahiagrass because that's most commonly what our livestock owners have in the state of Florida, at least in Central Florida. So what is a weed? Well, a weed needs sunlight, water, space, and various nutrients to grow. So what's the problem here? Those are all the things that your grass also needs. So weeds tend to steal the things that your grass needs to be successful. So to go back to that first question, what is a weed? A weed is absolutely anything that you don't want to be there. So if you have a pasture of Bahiagrass, anything that is not Bahiagrass in that pasture is considered a weed. Now, not all weeds are toxic, but they're not doing you any good if they're taking good grazable area away from your livestock. So weed management. The best approach to weed management is what we call an integrated approach. And this means using more than one of these techniques to control for your weeds. So we have things like mechanical control, that's mowing. And mowing is a really good way to mitigate weeds or at least knock them back at certain times of the year, as long as you know the life cycle of that weed. We don't want to go out and mow a field of weeds that have seed heads on them, because that is a sure way to just spread your problem around. So again, knowing what species of weeds you're working with allows you to better understand when's the best time to bring your tractor out there and mow them. Biological control is one that isn't super common, but we have a few options for specific weeds using biological controls. And the example I have here is beetles. We can actually release beetles that are very plant specific to things like tropical soda apple, air potato. There's different types of beetles that will only eat those plants and have proven to be a really good method for eradicating those species in your pasture. And then most commonly is chemical control, and that's through the use of herbicides. And so this is one of the best means of controlling weeds, but it's always important to follow the label and definitely understand how to calibrate your equipment if you're spraying yourself. And then as general guidance, weeds are always best targeted when they are immature. That's the time when they can most actively take up chemicals, if that's the control method you're using, before they get to where they're seeding out. So I want to kind of start with how toxic plants affect your livestock. It's one thing for us to tell you, oh, this plant is toxic, but you know, there's many ways that toxic plants will actually affect your livestock. And the severity of a toxic event will depend on these factors. So the amount of the toxic plant that your animal has eaten. In certain plants, a little bit can go a long ways, while in others, it takes a little bit over a long amount of time to see those effects. Next is the quality of the plant. The stage of the plant when it's eaten can greatly affect toxicity. For instance, nightshade is a severely toxic plant to livestock, and nightshade gets these little berries on it. And they start out green and then they turn darker and darker until they're a dark black. And when those berries are immature and green, they're actually more toxic at that stage than when they're the dark black color. The state of your animal. This sometimes is an uncontrollable. If you have an old horse in poor condition, it's likely not going to handle the consumption of a toxic plant in the same way that a young, well-conditioned horse would handle that same toxic plant. So keep in mind that it's not good for a young, well-conditioned horse to eat these toxic plants. They might fare a little bit better under certain circumstances. We kind of alluded to it just a second ago, this idea of acute versus chronic toxicity. Acute toxicity is when a small amount is eaten over a short time frame and is lethal. That's things like crotalaria, nightshade, and then you have chronic toxicity. Chronic toxicity means over time you're going to see those effects. So things like creeping indigo, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but creeping indigo is something that your animal must ingest a small amount over a long period of time to see those toxic effects. So it's not something that they get into one time and has negative effects on your animal. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give everybody a general idea of how toxic plants are affecting the biological processes in your animals. And we won't spend a ton of time on this, but it's just a general reference for the curious mind to know how certain plants are actually affecting your livestock. So we have cyogenetic plants, which these plants contain cyogenic glycosides, which is a naturally occurring plant toxin that's going to affect the oxygen carrying ability of the blood. This is things like milkweed and cherry trees. Next, we have alkaloids. Not all alkaloids are bad, but there are some alkaloids that are toxic, and these things can cause incoordination, staggering, tachycardia, and respiratory failure. A lot of these things, I'll just mention, a lot of these toxic avenues actually don't taste really well to the animal, which is why animals don't typically choose to eat toxic plants. You know, things like alkaloids and tannins produce a very bitter taste to the animal, so they're not typically going to select for that. Then you have photodynamic plants. This is a plant like lantana, and this affects animals that have unpigmented skin, which will then cause irritation when exposed to full sun. So sometimes you can see them scabbing up in those areas. Tannins, like seen in some variety of oaks, that can negatively affect the feed intake due to what we just talked about. The palatability isn't very good, so they're then going to go off their feed. It's going to lead to unthriftiness. It's going to lead to digestibility and efficiency issues, and it can also cause lesions in the rumen, liver, or GI tract. Saponin-containing plants also reduce that feed intake, can irritate the mucous membranes and digestive tract, lead to weight loss and a rough hair coat. So all around, makes your animal not look very bright. Volatile or essential oils lead to respiratory distress, and when eaten in high enough quantities over time can lead to death. And then I put at the bottom mechanical injury, and this can come with plants that are or maybe aren't even toxic, but things like fireweed and stinging nettle obviously are going to cause irritation to the gums or the mouth, and perhaps even once inside the stomach, which can lead to secondary issues. All right, so I'm going to start out with talking about some basic commonplace toxic weeds that you might find in your pasture. These are not yet the landscape plants that are toxic. These are just common plants that you're going to want to look out for on a day-to-day basis within your livestock pasture. And the first one is creeping indigo. And creeping indigo is a very popular toxic weed. And next to the plant name and the presentation, for most of these, I've given you the name of the herbicide that has been shown to best control these species. So for instance, Grazon Next has been shown to be the most effective herbicide against creeping indigo. So creeping indigo, as its name suggests, creeps along the ground and it has these pretty pink flowers. And this is, we talked about a chronically toxic plant. So your animal must ingest a certain amount of this plant over time, at least 2 to 3 weeks, for you to start seeing those signs of incoordination. Now, the thing with these chronically toxic plants is it doesn't mean that they're not a big deal, because they are. Once you start to see signs of toxicity in your animals, it's generally too late and there's no treatment. So at that point, it's too late. So you need to scout for these plants and control for them before you notice signs in your animal. To the right, I have showy crotalaria, also known as rattlebox. It gets this name because when the seed pods dry out and you walk through them, it sounds like the rattler on a rattlesnake. And showy crotalaria likes to grow as it's shown in this picture. It will get pretty tall, 6 to 12 feet tall. And it has a beautiful yellow flower. And showy crotalaria, in comparison to creeping indigo, is what we might consider acutely toxic. Crotalaria can be a little bit more harmful in the short term for your animals. So I always urge people to not just focus on the toxic weeds that have a reputation like creeping indigo, but be on the lookout for these other toxic weeds that might actually present a bigger problem over a shorter time frame. All right, next up, we have another acutely toxic plant, nightshade. Nightshade is prevalent early spring, late winter, around February. And in this picture, you can see it's a little bit more mature. You see the darker berries. That doesn't mean it's not toxic. It is still very toxic to your livestock. You should check fence lines. It likes to grow by itself near trees. So it can be kind of hard to spot. And I have some herbicide recommendations here, but typically I just like to pull it up or dig up this plant and get rid of it. Get rid of it in an area where you're sure that your livestock is not going to be able to get into it. Next, we have Perilla mint. This plant can be seen also growing by itself and can be very toxic to livestock over the long term. So Graze on Next, Milestone, and 2,4-D are good herbicide treatments for Perilla mint. Sickle pod, another toxic weed that has a pretty yellow flower, different from Crotalaria, but still can be very toxic. 2,4-D, Graze on Next, and glyphosate recommended for sickle pod control. The next one, castor bean, another plant that can grow by itself, but present quite a problem to livestock. So this one, either pull it up, dig it up, or glyphosate it. When I can, I like to just dig up or pull up any toxic weed when it's not too labor intense. More toxic weeds. The next one is coral ardesia. This is not only very toxic, but it's very invasive. So this I would definitely pull up. It tends to be a little woodier. So if you're gonna apply a herbicide, it needs to be glyphosate. Keep in mind, you know, coral ardesia likes to grow under trees and in brushy areas, but its red berry makes it stand out. Cherry trees in general are toxic to livestock. Ruminants are most susceptible. Seen here is a cherry laurel. These trees, I tend to recommend just getting rid of them. It's not something that you're gonna really use a herbicide on, but you can cut them down and maybe paint the stump with glyphosate. Bracken fern. Bracken fern is common in wooded areas. You can use chaparral if it's not in your Bahiagrass, or spot treat it with glyphosate or Graze on Next. And bracken fern will also grow in big groups, so it can easily start to take over. Next up is a Chinaberry tree. These are very common. I've seen issues with these when they're placed around hay rings for cattle. Glyphosate, imazapyr. This is one that you usually have to cut down, and then you can paint the stump with glyphosate so it doesn't grow back. All right, now we're gonna get into our toxic landscape plants. And while I'm not the landscape expert by any means, I wanna bring to your attention some of the common plants that might either appear or are available for you to even purchase at your home and garden stores. And they might be beautiful, but they're not really, they shouldn't be used where your livestock might potentially be. And that might even include your yard. If you like to let your horses graze in your yard like I do, I definitely stay away from the toxic landscape, because you turn your back once and they're like toddlers and they will be into every flower bed that you have. So the first one is oleander. They're beautiful, they come in all colors. They're not for livestock. Don't plant them near your livestock. We've already talked about Chinaberry. This is a larger Chinaberry tree in a neighborhood. Again, since it might not pose a huge risk to your livestock if they're not gonna be in a pasture, but I still would steer clear of it if I had the chance. Philodendron is another landscape plant, as well as sago palms. That are not recommended for livestock. Again, toxic occurrences with your livestock in these plants are probably very slim, but I still want to bring your attention to them and perhaps stay away from it if they're going to be in an area that's easily accessible by your livestock. Milkweed. Milkweed is great for butterfly gardens, great for pollinators, however, very toxic to livestock. In general, most of your butterfly garden plants are going to be toxic to livestock, so we would want to steer clear of those. Another one that is commonplace, I see a lot of the time in pastures, naturally occurring or otherwise, is lantana. It's another one that comes in a bunch of pretty colors. and can be very tempting to plant. But it already occurs more naturally than we'd like to see in pastures. And this is something that is definitely very woody, and you're gonna need to dig it up and then paint it with glyphosate to prevent it from coming back. And this is the one that we talked about that can cause the skin irritation for those animals that have no pigment in their skin. A couple other toxic landscapes, yellow jasmine, again, beautiful, not for livestock. Azaleas are another toxic, common toxic landscape plant. If you can keep these in an area that you can definitely keep your livestock out of, or you're not going to be near fence rows, don't plant them near your barn, then go ahead and plant your azaleas, but just be clear, they technically are toxic to livestock. Next, we're going to go into some common pasture weeds. And if consumed in large amounts, some of these technically can be considered toxic to your livestock. Pigweed and tropical soda apple being two of those plants that could technically be considered toxic, but we don't usually look at them as being toxic. Pigweed is a nuisance of a pasture weed that will completely take over all of your good forage if you're not careful. And this is one that I like to really warn people to know the life cycle. This pigweed, as shown in this picture, can get these seed heads on them that have thousands of tiny seeds, and it is not a plant that you want to mow when it is producing those seeds, because you will just completely make a bigger issue for yourself, and you'll have a pigweed farm and not a Bahiagrass pasture. So graze on next is really the only herbicide that we have that's pretty effective, and you might have to treat it more than one time. Caesar weed is a weed that if you've ever ridden through a wooded area and gotten those little burrs stuck on your saddle pad, then you've been through some Caesar weed. Caesar weed can also take over as a ground cover. Pasture guard, graze on next, and 2,4-D recommended for that. Tropical soda apple is something that you're going to need gloves on to pull up, but I recommend that you pull up while they're immature. They get these spines on them, and they're not pleasant if you are trying to take care of them with your bare hands. But this is also a species of weed that we do have a biological control for. So if you have a huge tropical soda apple issue, you can contact me or your local extension agent, and they can see about getting you some tropical soda apple beetles to release in your pasture to take care of these guys. Dayflower. Dayflower will form a bunch of, it almost looks like a grass, but it's very interwoven, and pasture guard and graze on next are the only things that really will take care of that. It will grow up around your gates and your fence lines, and it likes to be a little bit moist. Dog fennel is another one that just about everybody with a pasture has seen. Dog fennel is definitely best taken care of when it's immature. If you let it get to the height that it is in this picture, it's almost virtually impossible to get rid of it. And sometimes mowing can cause it to come back with a vengeance. So this is another one that I caution you in the mechanical control. And I would say definitely use chemical control when the dog fennel is very immature, and try to get an early hold on it. Next, we have what we call arrowleaf sitta or tea weed. I see this in a lot of horse pastures this time of year. Graze on next, pasture guard. It's pretty easy to take care of. Also, evening primrose is another pretty yellow flowered weed that's pretty low growing, and something as simple as 2,4-D will take care of evening primrose without much of a problem. So we like the weeds that are easily targeted and easy to take care of. But again, these weeds are still taking away area where you can have good forage for your animals. So we recommend that you scout for them and take care of them. Fireweed. I get a lot of calls from horse people about fireweed because it can definitely cause that irritation around the muzzle for your horse. It's not pleasant. If you've ever come across fireweed with your bare skin, you know that it burns and it continues to burn for a long time. Graze on Next works fairly well against fireweed. It's something that likes to come up around barns, around the fence lines. It's very opportunistic, so it tends to come up where there is nothing else. But Graze on Next or Pasture Guard should take care of that for you. So in summary for my portion, the number one rule, if there's good forage available, then all of the things that we talked about, your livestock are likely not going to venture into eating the toxic weeds. They'd rather have good hay, grass, grain, than they would these bitter tasting toxic weeds. But it's not to say that you don't have the one curious horse or group of cattle that might want to try some of these toxic weeds, and then you are going to have a problem on your hands. So pasture management and grazing management is the best prevention. Keep track of what's growing in your pasture and manage what you can manage. You can control the grazing of your pastures. You can control the number of animals you put out there. You can put them on a rotational schedule. And you can also work to identify the weeds that you have, learn the life cycle of those weeds. We have weeds that are summer weeds. We have weeds that are winter weeds, which means, you know, for our summer weeds, the onset of cold weather starts to kill them off. But other weeds are annual weeds that like to thrive during that time of the year. So know what those weeds are, work with your extension agent to identify them, and then develop a control plan, whether that be a chemical or an integrated approach to broadcast treat these weeds or spot spray them in some areas to keep a control throughout the year. So here I've linked a couple of our University of Florida IFAS resources for you. The first link is to a general weed identification website, which is really good. It has a lot of pictures of all of the main pasture weeds that you might come across. And then the second link is the weed management guide that's just been updated for pastures. And so it not only, once you've decided what weed you have, it tells you what chemical works best on within what type of grass for that weed. Because we don't want to kill our grass, so we want to use the right treatment, but it needs to be a treatment that's specific to kill that weed so you're not just wasting your money. And something else I should mention is I went through a lot of different pasture weeds, toxic, non-toxic, some toxic landscape plants that you're going to want to stay away from, but I definitely did not include everything. This is not an all-inclusive presentation. That would take simply all day. Here in the state of Florida, we have every weed that likes to grow, toxic, non-toxic. They are all here. So just take these as an example and an example of how you should be managing for them. But certainly there is a vast list of other potential pasture weeds and yard plants and landscaping plants that might pose a problem to you. And if you're not sure, always reach out to our office, and somebody in our office can definitely help you and lead you in the right direction before you stumble across something that's maybe not meant for your livestock. And in these times, we want to make sure that you can find us online. So I've linked one of our Facebook resources and our website, and then my information. You can still call my office number and your message will get forwarded to me, or chat with me via email. That's probably the easiest way to communicate in these times. I hope that you learned something, and stay tuned for part 2, which is going to be actual landscape design techniques with our horticulture agent.